We've all heard presentations that are either not that interesting, too hard to follow, or just not very scientific. There's a balance to be struck, and probably a time limit to observe. So in this video, I'll give you some tips on how to improve your scientific presentations. There are many videos out there on how to improve your public speaking skills, and I don't want to dwell too long on the obvious, so I'll go over this first part as quickly as I can. But for any presentation, speak clearly with enough volume and use inflection. Speak to the audience, so don't read off a script. And if like me you're a non-native speaker, look up the pronunciations you're not sure about. And finally, practice. The more you do this, the better you'll get at it. Specifically for live presentations, I recommend that at least you try and stand upright, so don't slouch, and unless you're pointing at something, try and face the audience. For online presentations, I recommend that you try and find a quiet environment with reasonable acoustics. You test your setup beforehand, and during the presentation, try to avoid touching your microphone. Finally, perhaps the most important for any presentation is to know your audience. That means using the appropriate style and difficulty of language, adjusting your explanations and figures to the level of understanding, and I'm not going to tell you how to dress, but just be aware that that too has an effect on how people perceive you. That brings us to the main part of this video. Just like scientific writing, a scientific presentation must adhere to a logical structure. This will not only help with understanding the subject matter, but it will also be more engaging. I would recommend at least roughly following the hourglass model. So begin with the broader context, then gradually build towards the research question that's going to be addressed by this study, and only after that should you start talking about the specific methods used and the specific observations made in this particular study. Once you've covered that, move away from the specifics again and try to place the results into a larger context, talking about the conclusion, its implications, the limitations, and possible angles for future research. In short, you should save specific information for the middle of your talk and reserve the rest of your talk for providing a more general context. At face value, this might appear identical to the structure for a typical scientific paper, and that is because it largely is. A scientific presentation is a very different format when it comes to the amount of detail you can explain, the extent to which people can check your claims and references, and of course the style of language. But when it comes to the general structure, it really is more or less the same as a scientific paper, so use that to your advantage. If you've already written about your research, or if this presentation is about someone else's paper, then a great way to start making your slides is simply by copying the headers from the written version and using those as a starting point for your structure. Of course you should change the wording, delete a couple slides, add a couple slides, but purely as a starting point, this can get you past the empty canvas and give you something you can actually work with. The order in which you make your slides is a matter of preference, but I will now elaborate on each part of the presentation in the order you should present it. First, you should start with some background. It is highly unlikely that everyone in the audience is already aware of the importance of your study, and even if they are, they'll probably still want to see how well you convey the broader context. The better you do this, the more likely people are to listen to the rest of your story. You don't have to dedicate a lot of time to this, but when presenting a study, never skip over its relevance. After you've provided some context, you should gradually get more specific and build towards the research question. You can state it literally if you want, or you can describe what was studied and how it fits into the context you just provided. Here's a short example. Let's say you studied the effect of 3 cheap-to-produce feed types on the well-being of chickens. Doesn't sound particularly exciting, but a little context can go a long way towards engaging the audience. In 2019, there were at least 25.9 billion domestic chicken used as livestock. That is over 3 times the human population that year, and clearly chickens continue to grow in numbers rapidly. So evidently, chicken well-being concerns an enormous number of animals. Moreover, it is also well known that meat quality positively benefits from animal well-being. Hence we compared 3 feed types, each of which is cheap enough to compete with existing feed types, to see their effect on the well-being of chickens. This whole story costs a few seconds, 2 slides, and it clearly conveys the relevance of this study. If you have more time, you can spend more on the relevance, but my point is that by placing it all the way at the beginning of your presentation, you prime the audience to listen attentively to the rest of your talk. You could go one step further and engage your audience even more by interacting with them. In the chicken feed example, I could have asked audience members to raise hands if they regularly eat chicken, and then raise hands again if they're willing to pay more for expensive chicken that's had a better life. This works really well for topics that might otherwise seem dull, because you're forcing the audience to think about how they are affected by the context of your research. The tricky part is, of course, to not make it seem forced, so I recommend only doing this if you feel comfortable doing it. Also, you should be aware of sensitive issues. Asking who eats chicken probably doesn't upset many people, but if you're studying a serious disease like cancer, maybe forego the questions and instead just explain how many lives are affected. Now you might think to yourself, alright, fair enough, but my research does not have such a clear relationship with our daily lives. And of course there's some truth to this. Some studies are more fundamental, others are applied. Some studies are just easier to sell than others. But no matter how fundamental your research is, there's always some background you can provide that makes the relevance of your study clearer to the audience. While it may not directly influence everyone's lives, it is simply easier to listen to a story when you know why it was studied in the first place. To give you some specific pointers, here are some example research topics that go from very clear in application to very fundamental, and questions you could ask yourself to provide context. We'll start simple. Suppose you're studying the genomics of some human virus. This one should be obvious. Ask yourself what the symptoms of infection are, or how frequent infections occur, and whether the results of your study could be used in diagnosis, treatment, or prevention. Second is an example that is slightly more fundamental. Suppose you're studying the shape of some specific receptor. You might think to yourself that this is just out of scientific curiosity, but you can still sell it as being relevant to others. Ask yourself whether this receptor has been associated with a disease or condition. Is it perhaps involved in some important pathway? Did you use an interesting new way to study it? These are all bits of information you could start your talk with to provide some background. Third, suppose you're presenting a general tool or method used in science. Perhaps you feel like there is little novelty there and you're just explaining how it works. But still, I would recommend that you start with context. How many studies use or should use this tool? Is it ever misused or misunderstood? And how does it affect the conclusions of studies that use it? You can ask similar questions if your research involves developing or improving some methodology. What is the method intended for? How often is it used? Are there any other methods that try this? And do they have shortcomings? With that, you can smoothly transition to how your study is relevant and what exactly it is improving on. For the last example, let's say you're studying something extremely fundamental with no clear application at all. Maybe it really is only interesting for the sake of understanding it. Maybe you're trying to prove a long-standing conjecture, or maybe this is just a proof of principle. In cases like this, I recommend that you don't try and force some obscure connection to an application, but instead explain why it is scientifically interesting. Have others tried to study this? How long has it been an open problem? Has there been some difficulty in studying it before? And will this allow you to study other things? Again, you don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but before you touch on the methods or the results, it should be clear to everyone in the audience what was studied and why it was studied. Once you get to the methods, this is usually where you can get a little creative and probably score some extra points. If the study used some fancy technique, then try to make a figure explaining how it works. It's also fine to use someone else's visualization as long as you give proper attribution. Spend ample time preparing your wording for this part so that everyone in the audience understands to some extent what this method does and how it works. Because a good explanation of the methodology not only helps with ease of understanding, but can also engage your audience. Lastly, keep in mind that when you explain how the methods work, you should also convey how that is supposed to address the research question, because this may be obvious to you, but not necessarily to everyone else in the audience. Even if you're presenting the methods to someone that knows them better than you, they still probably want to see how well you can explain them. Now that everybody hopefully understands what you did, it's time to summarize the results. If this is your own research, then at this stage it's usually also appreciated if you explain any difficulties you perceived and how you adjusted the experiments accordingly. Like, we intended to do A, but that didn't work because of B, and so we went with C. If something doesn't produce the results that you expect, or doesn't produce any meaningful results at all, this is still valuable information. Science is an objective search for understanding. Do not only present positive findings. With that said, generally speaking, I would spend proportionally less time on the results in a presentation than I would in writing. Show tables, plots, or summarizing figures like a Venn diagram, and consider highlighting the most important findings. Avoid large tables or long lists of things that were and weren't observed, because nobody really has the ability to check and compare all your findings as they're being shown anyway. The key point here is to summarize. If you really feel the need to have all the results available for discussion and the questions of your presentation, then either make it very clear which part the audience should be looking at a given time, or better yet, move any large amounts of data to some supplementary slides that you only show should you need them to answer a question. Remember that the interesting part is not specifically what you saw, but rather what the larger implications are. A presentation is rarely the right format to dwell on details. So unless you are specifically instructed by your teacher or supervisor to do otherwise, you should just convey the overall ideas and spend more time on the discussion. That brings us to the most important part. The discussion is another point where you can probably earn the most points. Here you get to explain the conclusions drawn from the results, the implications they have for the field as a whole, any limitations of the study, and how you would improve it if done again. Contrary to the results, try to be thorough in the discussion. This part shows your understanding of the results. And finally, at the end you can make suggestions for what would be interesting to study next. I would recommend ending your presentation with any relevant acknowledgements and an invitation to questions. Some people prefer to show a list of references at the end, but again, nobody is going to check them while they're sitting there. If you have a list of references for your teacher or supervisor to check, you can either show citations within a slide, or just only have the references slide somewhere at the end without actually showing it during the presentation. Personally, looking at a list of references at the end of a presentation feels a bit silly. To get better at answering questions by the audience, the most obvious thing to do is of course to be well prepared. Look up any terms or any methods that were new to you or your audience and be keenly aware of any limitations of the study. I highly recommend that when you get a question, the first thing you do is to try and paraphrase it. If you immediately start answering, you better be sure you understood the question correctly. Because if you ask, "Did that answer your question?" and the response is, sure, that probably means they meant something different and don't want to waste more of your time. If you don't know the answer to a question, just say that you don't know. If you're just making something up, chances are it will get noticed and that comes across as unprofessional. You're allowed to speculate as long as you make it clear that you are in fact speculating. If you came well prepared and you paraphrased the question and you gave it a shot, and it's fine if you don't always know the answers. So that's all about the general structure, which brings us back to the overview. Writing an overview like this is a style choice. It has certain benefits and certain drawbacks. When giving a live presentation or a lecture, I do it because it helps me. Seeing the overview helps me prepare to switch to whatever is coming up next and transition to it in a way that it comes across as a coherent story. Not really necessary for videos as I could just cut it out, but still I like showing the structure of my story. Of course, you don't have to do this. Even in a live presentation, you can say whatever would be said during a transitional slide in whatever slide came before. But if you ever find yourself awkwardly surprised by the changing content when switching slides, then consider adding a transitional slide here and there, or place a cue at the end of the slide. This could be some sentence connecting the two slides, or even just a single word just to remind you of what's coming next. Of course, you can also just use a presentation mode if one is available. Next is something I'm sure you all know, but you still see it very frequently. Don't clutter your slides. Note that I'm not saying you should minimize slide content. You also hear this a lot, but minimalism usually isn't appropriate for a scientific presentation. There should be substance, material to compare and discuss. You can of course reduce clutter by using keywords instead of whole sentences. And any paragraph of more than a few sentences probably doesn't belong in a slide anyway. If your presentation time is very short, you might want to forego the transitional slides. And of course, there are a lot of unnecessary elements in plots and figures that can be easily left out. Take this scatter plot from earlier in the video. The default plotting function in base R adds a box around the figure, prints the values in the billions using the E notation, and prints the numbers on the y-axis sideways. The popular library ggplot2 has arguably better default behavior, but still uses this E notation. 5.0 E plus 09 is just 5 billion. With large numbers like this, you could greatly increase readability by just specifying that the axis shows billions. Also, if you're just trying to make the point that there's a large, growing number of chicken, you don't really need a grid in the background. What you can do to improve your plots largely depends on what you want to show. No one-size-fits-all plotting routine exists. You have to play around with the code or the image editor you're using until you are convinced that it should take a little time to understand what one is looking at, and that what is shown is the important information and only the important information. For more specific advice on improving figures, I highly recommend reading some of the works of Edward Tufte. You're not going to find anyone better at pinpointing the common fallacies in graphic design and plotting data, and the books give very practical advice that you can directly apply to your own visualizations. What I do want to show you last is Color Brewer. This is a tool that allows you to get a color scheme with maximal separability while still preserving other qualities like being suitable for printing ink or for people with color blindness. Around 8% of the male population has red-green color blindness, and yet it is still perplexingly common to see heat maps and other figures that use a red and green color scheme. So don't do this, and if you don't feel like reinventing the wheel, look up Color Brewer. If you're making your presentation within RStudio, as I'll show in the next video, you can use this tool from within R using the package R Color Brewer. Lastly, there's of course the elephant in the room. Maybe you don't like presenting. Perhaps it makes you feel nervous or uncomfortable, which is very understandable. If this bothers you, there's 3 pieces of advice that I can give you. First, try not to think about this presentation as the goal, but rather as a part of a continuous process. Academia is all about learning. Some people have more aptitude for presenting, others find it harder, but everyone can learn. And as long as you are improving your skill, then who cares what anyone else can do? Even if your presentation was objectively the worst to have ever been given, then still, good on you. You did it, and you'll probably receive feedback on what specifically to improve for next time. This is how you should view all your academic skills. Focus on the process, not this one specific instance. A good grade is nice, improving your skills is nicer. Second, if you really don't like being the center of attention, then don't be. We live in a world where scientific presentations are dominated by slideshows. Even this video is a slideshow. If you make your slides really captivating, then people will focus on the slides and not on you. Use this to your advantage. You can convey the importance of whatever everyone is looking at in the safety of the background. Finally, if you ever feel like everyone is better at something than you, then you have to do yourself a favor and look up the term imposter syndrome. This is a very well-known psychological concept that is all the more common in academia. Maybe you are surrounded by geniuses, while you are only just getting by. Or maybe that is a really skewed interpretation of reality. If you've made it into university and you're preparing a scientific presentation, then surely that means you've done pretty well so far, so don't doubt yourself too much. Also keep in mind that it is really unlikely you'll get a failing grade just for being nervous. A great scientific presentation requires a large amount of preparatory work. It's all about good structure, good explanation, and conveying scientific knowledge. As long as your effort preparing shows, as long as you have good structure in your story and sufficient depth, then you have nothing to worry about, just something to improve. I hope this can be of help in making your presentation. In the description I've added a link of an example of good and bad slides that you can have a look at if you want. In the next part, I'm going to show you how you can quickly make good looking presentations in RStudio. Good luck and thanks for watching.